Some Miami Cubans are literally terrorists. This is a people's history of how Miami Cubans have tried to destabilize Cuba over the years. Now, growing up in Florida, Miami Cubans have been called a whole lot of things. They've been called Gusano, Miami Cubans, white Cubans, and more. But do y'all even know how they came to the United States in the first place? Let's get into it. Now, it started with the Cuban Revolution in 1959 when Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, and other Cuban revolutionaries overthrew the US-backed dictatorship and took power. And as they took power, they rid Cuba of the mafia, drug lords, and expropriated land from wealthy landowners. And because of this, people left. Now, the first wave of Cubans who went to Miami were not just everyday people looking for a better life. A lot of them were wealthy businessmen, members of the mafia, and supporters of the US-backed dictator Batista. And when they left, they were pissed off because they lost their land, their money, and a lot of other things. And they figured that when they got to Miami, though, they wouldn't be there for long because the US would help them retake Cuba. Now, this so-called Golden Exile group took over places like Little Havana and Hialeah in Miami, and they brought some of their wealth and their deep hatred for the new Cuban government, and that would reshape politics in Miami and in Florida for decades. Now, throughout the years, Miami Cubans plotted to overthrow the Cuban government with the help of the United States because, duh, the most famous attempt was the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, when about 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles known as Brigade 2506 launched an attack on Cuba's coast. And it was a complete and total disaster because within 3 days, Cuban forces defeated them and captured over 1,100 men. And despite getting belt to ass in the Bay of Pigs, the Miami Cubans just didn't give up. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Miami became a hub for anti-Castro terrorist groups like Omega 7 and Alpha 66. These groups bombed places in Miami that did business with Cuba, targeted Cuban diplomats, and even attacked fellow Cuban Americans who dared to suggest making peace with the island. Omega 7 alone committed nearly 50 terrorist acts by 1983, including political assassinations and bombing of cigar companies, banks, and businesses that sent medicine to Cuba. In the 1990s, Cuban exiles ran paramilitary camps to train people to overthrow the Cuban government. They were also involved in terrorist attacks on Cuban hotels in the 1990s. They flew into Cuban airspace to drop leaflets encouraging citizens to overthrow Fidel Castro, tried to smuggle grenades into Cuba, planned to bomb a Cuban nightclub, and tried to assassinate Fidel Castro multiple times. And that's not even all of it, right? Crazy. Now, today, the spirit of these Cuban terrorist exiles lives on, specifically in Florida, where we have had to deal with them for years. We have Cuban American lawmakers from Miami like Mario Diaz-Balart, Carlos Jimenez, Maria Salazar, and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who have pushed the hardest line against Cuba. They demand tough sanctions and oppose any engagement with the island. They encourage the current administration to starve the island nation for their own good. These are people who play a big role in determining foreign policy when it comes to Cuba. Now, demographically, Miami Cubans are predominantly white. Black Cubans are more likely to just stay in Cuba. And just a quick aside, when I visited Cuba in 2019, most of my encounters were with Afro-Cubans. And I will say that the white Cubans in Cuba were so friendly and hospitable too. And we carried on many conversations about life in America. And I was snitching, y'all, like for real. And my bad Southern accent, speaking Spanish, telling them about police brutality, mass shootings, poverty, homophobia, and more. And when I tell y'all they were gagged because they just couldn't fathom it. All right, back to the story. The Miami Cuban community does vote overwhelmingly Republican at 68%, and Trump was the first Republican candidate in history to win the majority of the Hispanic vote, and that was thanks to Miami Cubans. And remember how I said that some Miami Cubans are terrorists? Well, that was for a reason. The reason is that the anti-Castro fanaticism seems to be slowly but surely dying. Polls also show that younger Cuban Americans are starting to care less about the Castro boogeyman rhetoric and more about issues like affordable housing, rising insurance rates, and traffic. So in short,